Thanks for checking out CPUCores on Steam. CPUCores has one goal in mind, and that is to maximize the FPS of whatever game that you're playing. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how the software looks as well as how the software functions. So first of all, when you first run the software within Steam, you'll see that Steam will show that you're actually using the CPU core software. This is part of the Steam integration. When you first launch the software, it detects all your different games and sets itself up in Steam. So I'm going to close the software and I'm going to show you what it looks like in a moment here. So we're going to launch it. You're going to see that it starts detecting all my games here. I have a little bit over 100 games. And you can see all the different games here. Now we can actually go into a different mode, a grid mode within CPUCores, and we can kind of expand the different listings in case you want to search for your games in a little bit of a different way. We can then go back to the default listing mode and we can search for our games. Let's type Duke Nukem, for example. We can search for Duke Nukem, or we could just delete our search and scroll through the games ourselves. Now, CPUCores maximizes your game's FPS by looking at how your CPU interacts with your operating system, your games, and then just kind of generic applications that you have on your PC. And so essentially CPUCores does 5 core things. The first thing is the direct Steam integration, which we just reviewed. It automatically detects your game, as well as when you start a game within CPUCores will send a trigger over to your Steam client to launch the game, and then CPUCores does its thing. For example, you see that I'm inside the CPUCores application. However, if I launch a game through CPUCores, let's take Duke Nukem again for an example. So we're going to launch Duke Nukem here. Now you'll notice my Steam friends list has showed that I'm now playing Duke Nukem. And we can go ahead and close this. And then it'll revert back into nothing. So CPUCores, as a demonstration, showed you the game detection and then launching it. And then it shows your Steam friends list actually switching over to the game that you're actually playing. So your Steam friends list will not say that you're playing CPUCores. It'll say that you're playing Duke Nukem or Ark or Arma or whatever the game is. So that's part of the Steam integration. It makes it really easy. So you pretty much just start CPUCores and then click the start game, and that's it. You don't have to mess around with configuring anything specific for the game. You don't have to mess around with anything specific to your OS. You don't have to mess around with anything. It's super easy to use. Now, part of what CPUCores does is operating system optimization. I've broken it down in a couple different categories. It does process core shifting, and what I mean is if we take a look at your task manager, for example, task manager will show that for this example we have a dual core CPU, and you'll see that I have lots of things going on. I'm recording a video, obviously. I also have a Twitch stream running. I have Steam running. I have a couple different web browsers running. I have my video editing software. I have a lot of different things running at once. Now, when CPUCores first starts, it'll take all the operating system processes and switch them over to the first core. And that enables the operating system, first of all, to be a little bit more efficient, as it doesn't have to switch between cores for how it services each thread that it has. So overall, right there, it's a little bit more efficient. What it also does is it allows you to isolate different processing cores to be used exclusively for a game. So, for example, if we go ahead and start a program within CPUCores, and let's do just a generic, we're going to use MS Paint. We're going to pretend MS Paint is a game, a non-Steam game. And we're going to use MS Paint because it uses virtually zero processing power, and it helps us kind of demonstrate this first point. So we're going to start this. MS Paint starts right here. And right away we can see that our first core usage goes up. Our second core usage goes down. And our second core still has a little bit going on, and that's because I have a video recording software that's recording this video. And I have CPUCores set. If we go to the advanced and we go to our whitelist, we have a whitelist telling CPUCores to not do anything to my video recording software, meaning that to use whatever cores the video recording software wants to use. But we'll take notice here that the main core processing power has gone up, and that's because CPUCores has moved the operating system processes over to the first core, and then it also does things like looking at the services that are going on and then processes in general. It makes modifications to give the most amount of CPU available to your game. So for example, if we take a look at let's take a look at my web browser, for example. Let's take a look at Chrome. So if we take a look at Chrome here, Chrome has been set to the first processor, and Chrome's priority has been lowered as well. If we take a look at Chrome, we can see the priority is set to below normal. And that's one of the advanced features within CPUCores that constrain your web browser. But if we also take a look at, let's take an example, let's see here. Let's take a look at Search Indexer. Search Indexer is something that's known to be a resource hog on Windows. We can see here that CPUCores has isolated that to the first processor, and in addition, CPUCores has set the affinity to this to be low. So if a game is competing for CPU resources, it'll be able to take more CPU resources than what Search Indexer can take for itself. So that's one of the things CPUCore does, is it isolates the operating system to the first core. It takes a look at the services, and then it takes a look at your OS, just processes in general, and make sure that those processes use less amount of CPU to give more available to your game. And then the next thing, the game optimization. Let's undo this here. The game optimization allows CPUCores to do things like disable hyperthreading specific for just that game, to set a game on a dedicated core. I only have a two core system here, so this option I'll probably disable. But let's say I did want to enable it. If I enable this and then started a game, let's do Duke Nukem again. Whoop. So if I start Duke Nukem, dedicated cores only, when Duke Nukem starts, again we see that it says in-game Duke Nukem. If we go to look at the actual Duke Nukem process, we'll see that CPUCores is forcing it onto a set processor, processor number 1, and that it's never going to allow it to go anywhere but there. And we're just going to go ahead and close this. Oop. And then minimize this. All right, let's bring this back up. So the second part, or the third part, the game optimization, CPUCores will put it on dedicated cores if that's what you have enabled. It'll do per game hyperthreading if you have that enabled or disabled. And it integrates directly with Steam, so you just have to click a button and CPUCores does everything else. As far as a non-Steam game, you can actually click this, run a non-Steam game. We selected MS Paint, but you could select World of Warcraft, you could select Photoshop, you could select a game from any other non-Steam source. So you could do that as well. Or what you can do is you can click on this area here. This loads all the different processes that you have running. I don't have any other games running right now, but let's say Fraps, for example. Instead of Fraps, let's say this was Minecraft. What you could do is you could select Minecraft, you could select maybe the Java service or the Java process for Minecraft, and you could click these two and click CPUCores it. And essentially what that'll do is that'll do all the OS optimization, the game optimization, the non-game, whatever sort of things, but instead of doing the Steam integration, it'll launch, instead of the Steam integration launch, it'll attach to the processes and do everything that it would as if it were a Steam game. And then there's non-Steam optimization. So for example, when you start a game from CPUCores, let me remove the filter. When you start a game from CPUCores, any other programs that you happen to have running, such as, let's say you have a Word document, a Notepad document, let's say you have an Excel spreadsheet, or any other piece of software that you have running. Maybe it's a music player, maybe something like that. CPUCores will take a look at the application, and depending on what it is, it'll do certain things to constrain the amount of CPU again. So it'll put all that back on the OS core, and then certain things like web browsers or flash players, CPUCores will squeeze out even more CPU by constraining that process to limit the resources that it uses. So that means you can play whatever game that you're playing and, let's say, watch a Twitch stream at the same time, or maybe listen to a YouTube video, and you won't have to worry about the Twitch stream or the YouTube video causing your FPS to plummet when there's a ton of stuff going on with whatever Twitch stream or whatever video you're watching or whatever. So this makes Flash and video not affect your game as much as it would without it. And then there's some extra things within CPUCores. So let's just review the app a little bit more. When we started, again, we have all the different games here. We can go into the grid mode. Grid mode is just another way of viewing things. And then there's an advanced mode. In the advanced mode, you have the ability to toggle the web browser constraining. That's something that we quickly reviewed. That's, again, for limiting the amount of CPU that like a Twitch stream could use or like a YouTube video. If you want to set a game to work on a specific core, and this is more for if you have like a 4-core processor, let's say your game only can operate on 2 cores but not 3 cores, you can actually set whatever type of core assignment you want right in here. But generally speaking, you can just leave this. If you want to run CPU cores unrelated to gaming but just have CPU cores manage the OS, you have that option to right here. We have a stream option here, and this is just for the Steam configuration, And this generally, you don't have to do anything, but if you're running multiple Steam libraries and for some reason CPUCores isn't detecting them all, you can actually configure individual Steam libraries here. But generally speaking, the Steam detection works pretty flawlessly. You have the ability to whitelist, meaning that CPUCores can ignore a particular application. I'm doing this right now for my video recording software, which is why you see CPU going on both cores, even though I've enabled CPUCores for, let's say, the Duke Nukem or the MS Paint game and program, just as a demo. So I have a camera recorder bypassing the CPU core settings. So this you may not use, but in case you need to, the option is there. And then there's a new Twitch feature, and this is something that was just added. And what this allows you to do, this is more for people who stream really high-end streams and also play some really high-end games. So if you enable this, and I have it set for OBS, if you enable this, it'll allow you to carve out a certain amount of CPU power just for your OBS. And generally, you'd want to enable this at the same time as enabling game-specific core settings. So what this will do is you can carve out a certain amount of CPU just for OBS and a certain amount of CPU just for your video game, and then of course a certain amount of CPU that goes for your OS and otherwise your non-gaming applications. And that ensures that programs and games and your streaming software don't overlap and step into one another, causing FPS drops in your game. So as we all know, if you're playing a game and you're in an area that has a ton of action, your stream software suddenly will spike in the amount of CPU it uses. And then if your streaming software spikes, that can cause your FPS of your game to decrease and make a situation that isn't very fun to be in. So this, you can constrain the amount of processing power that your streaming software uses. And then there's also a severe constraint if you want to do things a little bit more in an advanced way. So this, if you're a streamer, I'd recommend kind of playing around with this and seeing what your results are. And so that's basically it. The software is very easy, not too many options, mostly because it auto-detects itself, it sets itself up, it does everything automatically when you start it within Steam. So there are some benchmark videos. I think I have about 10 of them. If you go to the CPUCores Steam page and then scroll down a little bit and view the discussions, there's a sticky here, Game Benchmarks of CPUCores. The very beginning shows a little bit about my benchmark system, but then you can actually see the benchmark results. Here is about 14% increase with Left 4 Dead 2, a little over 6% with Tomb Raider, 58% with Team Fortress 2, and then we have Arma 3, CSGO, Verdun, Ark, Path of Exile, and I'm going to be doing more and more benchmarks over time. And the methodology that I use for doing the actual benchmarks is posted up here. A little bit about the system, why I chose the hardware, and kind of what I'm doing. And so hopefully this explains everything about CPUCores, how it works, why it improves FPS. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the CPU forums on Steam. And otherwise, check out all the different screenshots, and happy gaming.